Welcome everyone. Minister Dallas, Associate Minister Rupor, members of the Alberta Asia Advisory Council, ladies and gentlemen, welcome. My name is Jordan Dupuy and I'm with the Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada, one of the co-organisers of today's event. The Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada is a think tank on Canada's relations with Asia. It's headquartered in Vancouver and we have an office in Toronto, which is where I'm based. The foundation brings together people and knowledge to provide current research, analysis and commentary on Canada's trans-Pacific relations. One of our most significant undertakings in recent years is our National Conversation on Asia. You might recognise the language right here. Indeed, the National Conversation on Asia is in part the motivation for bringing us all together this afternoon. The initiative is private sector funded and civil society led to get Canadians of all stripes, whether corporations, whether governments, students or interested citizens, thinking about and acting on what Asia's rise means to us, means to our companies, means to our governments and means to our communities. Since the National Conversation on Asia's launch in 2011, we've held events in 7 provinces and 1 territory. Events such as this one tonight, large public lectures, small group discussions, policy consultations, and events at universities for students across the country. Most of these events we undertake in partnership with organisations that have interests that intersect with ours. And today is no exception, as our partner organisations today are the Alberta Ministry of International and Intergovernmental Relations, Central Alberta Access Prosperity and Red Deer College. Through the National Conversation on Asia, to get our initiative moving, we've brought together a group of advisors from multiple sectors, all with deep Asia experience. And we've called this group our Futures Group on Asia. The group is co-chaired by David Emerson, Canada's former Minister of Foreign Affairs and International Trade, and the other co-chair is Joseph Caron, Canada's former Ambassador to China, to Japan and High Commissioner to India. And as part of this Futures Group on Asia, we're very lucky to have one of the members with us tonight, Peter Sutherland. The group represents many regions of the country and lots of different sectors. Additionally, as part of the National Conversation on Asia, we conduct polling of Canadians' views on Asia annually and have convened 4 expert task forces to investigate crucial policy areas in Canada's relations with the Asia-Pacific region. We've looked at Canada-Asia energy relations. We've looked at Canada's engagement with Asian governance institutions, multilateral governance institutions. We've looked at human rights, and tonight we'll get a sneak peek at preliminary findings of our task force on Asia competence. That is the skills, the knowledge, the capabilities that will allow us all, but particularly our companies, to be more attuned to and knowledgeable of Asian cultures, histories and languages, so as to increase our competitiveness in the region. This work dovetails expertly with the theme of tonight's session, which is Preparing Alberta for the Asian Century. And Alberta understands very well the imperative to engage Asia meaningfully, and has been at the forefront of efforts to engage Asia and increase access to markets in the region. The Government of Alberta has convened an Asia Advisory Council, which has been meeting for the past 2 days in Edmonton, and many of the Council's members are panellists with us here today. Just last month, Premier Redford led a mission to China to support small and medium-sized Alberta businesses and build market access. Associate Minister Teresa Rupor led a mission to China, Japan and Korea to support the province's trade promotion activities. And Minister Cal Dallas led a market access tour to 7 communities across the province to help more businesses become aware of trade and export promotion services offered by the Government of Alberta. And it gives me great pleasure to now introduce Minister Dallas, although in this environment he doesn't really need much introduction. Minister Dallas is Alberta's Minister of International and intergovernmental relations. Elected as a member of the Legislative Assembly for Red Deer South in 2008 and 2012. Before serving in elected office, Minister Dallas was Executive Director of the Red Deer Chamber of Commerce, and before that he worked in printing and publishing, including 9 years as publisher of the Red Deer Express. Minister Dallas.
Let me tell you that this entity, the college here, is a key component of all of the work that we're doing in terms of building our community and accessing new markets for our enterprises in the area, and it is indeed a very special place. The timing of this event couldn't be better. What we have here today is members of Alberta's Asia Advisory Council. They've spent the last 3 days discussing strategies to heighten Alberta's Asia. Our conversations today really do matter to Albertans. They help give us clear direction as we develop and grow markets in other parts of the world. We do that to get higher returns for our exported goods and services, to create more economic opportunity, investment, jobs and revenues to support the programs and services that Albertans rely on. A national conversation on Asia is imperative because the influence that countries like China and India have on the world's resources, commodities, and expertise is transformative. To adapt to the Asian century, we need to show resiliency as we expand our skills and knowledge to capture new opportunities. Our long-term prosperity really does depend upon it. This is why the Alberta government created an Asia Advisory Council to help fulfill a similar agenda to that of the Asia Pacific Foundation's national conversation on Asia, reaching out to Albertans for their thoughts and feedback about what we are doing well to succeed in Asia and how we can do even better. The Council in turn makes recommendations to my ministry informing public policy decisions related to Alberta's engagement in Asia. So I'm grateful to the council members for their valuable contributions to both my ministry and, of course, to our discussions today. I know full well that it is not only government working hard to increase Alberta's Asia competencies. There are many innovators right here in Red Deer focused on taking full advantage of the strengths this region offers in areas such as energy, agriculture, and education to meet the needs of Asia's growing population and expanding economy.
A little bit of a Hollywood flair to it. It's a Hollywood sneak preview of a report that is going to be released in 2 weeks' time. So really I'm going to talk about its content generally without getting into the actual recommendations. I think it's really appropriate that we're talking about it here in Alberta because, as noted, and as Minister Dallas noted, Alberta is really, and this isn't just being nice to the local crowd, Alberta really is ahead of the pack in thinking, talking, and teaching about issues of Asia competence, and particularly in talking about language skills and engagement with China. The question that arises is, why did we have to create an Asia competence task force? And it grew out of something broader, something that's been mentioned already, which is the National Conversation on Asia, a broad initiative that aimed at getting more Canadians to be thinking, talking about Asia. The National Conversation, as some of you will know, was funded entirely by private sector and civil society organizations. In other words, it reached well beyond simple, formal government involvement. The core issue coming out of the National Conversation, and really the core issue for us on the task force, was and is, how do we expand public emphasis and how do we expand expert emphasis on Asia? And we do this by reminding ourselves that changes in emphasis do not happen quickly and immediately. It's not a matter of central diktat where somehow, after a few good speeches, the system responds automatically. Systems in our country, as we know, in our society, respond slowly, they respond deliberatively. So the real question is, how can public consciousness catch up with reality? By reality, I mean the reality of trade, the reality of population movement, the reality of innovation, the reality of immigration, the reality of migration. These are the realities of our time. And consciousness means a deliberate way of thinking about it, deliberate choices about education, about training, about understanding. So how does broader public consciousness catch up with reality? What do we mean when we talk about expanding, building Asia competence? Essentially, a number of core definitions that helped us in the task force come to grips with what do we mean by competence. Competence means a combination of skills, skills of awareness, skills of comfort, which is very often cultural comfort, skills of connection that help Canadians and people from Asian countries to work together, to meet together, to create connections. Connections that could be cultural, connections that could be business. Obviously, business is very much at the center of our thinking because business drives financial reality. So a combination of skills that helps to create that competence. What level of skills? Skills that are at an initial level, skills of exposure to basic ideas of history, of geography, of culture. Higher levels of skill, experienced skills of living, again of education. And finally, at the highest level, skills of real expertise, be it sectoral expertise of business nature or notably language expertise. So we're really thinking in terms of that classic pyramid where exposure linking to experience and linking to direct expertise creates higher levels of skill. And so we talked about this within the task force, and we talked as well about what countries do we have in mind when we talk about Asia competence. And clearly a variety of countries that have growing importance for Canada. And in some cases, notably the case of Japan, have had importance for Canada over a long period of time. But as we know, these are the days of China rising. These are the days of focusing on the dealing with and interchange with China, of China's own importance in relationships with other countries. China has become Canada's second largest trading partner. And so we chose within the task force to focus on China. I'm very much aware, and I know that the Asia-Pacific Foundation has written about other countries of Asia, North Asia, South Asia, that are all of importance to Canada and will be of growing importance. So that is something not to forget. But at this point, at this time, our focus is still very much on China, China rising. Why does Asia competence matter? Clearly, it matters in public understanding because the public must catch up with the realities of trade, the realities of global relationships, and the realities of exchanges. There is, as one of our most recent, Asia Pacific Foundation's most recent public opinion poll shows, there is a recognition in broad public opinion terms of the importance of a series of countries to Canada's future prosperity. Clearly, the United States ranks first in public perception, and remember, these are public perceptions, so it's opinion. So the perception of the United States clearly ranking first, and if it only ranks at 75%, I suspect that members of the public may underestimate the importance of the United States to our prosperity. Interestingly, China ranks second. It comes in at 45% of public opinion saying that China ranks so highly for Canadian prosperity. With the recent trade agreement that has just been announced with the European Union, I would imagine that next year this opinion poll may have public opinion ranking the European Union somewhat higher. But as of the time when this poll was taken, the European Union ranked at 42%, plus a series of other countries. Interestingly, in public opinion, Japan only ranks at 33%, and that, I would suggest, is a failure of public opinion to understand objective reality. So, opinion is important. Opinion guides us. Opinion is something that shapes how we have to react and interact, and in particular will shape political decision makers. Opinion is not necessarily the absolute truth. It's opinion. Here is an example of a direct disconnect. Because on the one hand, Asia's importance is objective, and China's importance is objective and growingly. At the same time, we know that there is a deep deficit position within Canada. It's a deficit position on the lacking of people with knowledge, of people with awareness, of people available to help organizations and companies actually succeed in the business of engaging with Asia, and in particular with China. And at the bottom of the slide, if you can see it, and I'll draw your attention to it, in a study of Asia practitioners, in other words, people known to the Asia Pacific Foundation from the private sector, from the public sector, 60% of these practitioners reported to us last year that it is difficult to find Canadians with the necessary level of knowledge and awareness of Asia to carry out the jobs and the tasks that they know needs to be done. So this is the measure of the disconnect, where the people in the field say, that's lovely, people are ranking Asia so highly, but in fact, in reality, we don't have the people with talent who are able to do the jobs that we need to have done. And I have a challenge with finger competence. It's called pushing the right button. But I will learn. So, one of the things that we did within the task force is to ask ourselves, and what are other countries doing? And what we find, and again, some of you will know this, and many of you might not, and certainly for people outside this room, most will not have any idea as to how much other countries are doing to deal with the challenge of Asia competence within their own societies. We mentioned these within the report that will come out, in order to set a positive tone, as a way of reminding ourselves just how much other countries are perceiving this problem and how much other countries are doing to try to find solutions to the problem. So in Australia, in particular, the national government, the Commonwealth government, has issued a central policy paper, a white paper, just last year called Australia in the Asian Century. There are a whole series of follow-ups to it. It is not just a pretty paper with several days of headlines and now on the back burner. Tripartite work between public sector, para-public sector, private sector, work been going on raising public sector competency training, work in visas, work in education goals, work in achieving necessary funding, language targets, a whole series of follow-up activities within Australia to show that Asia competency is not merely something to be talked about for good speeches. New Zealand, the Asia-New Zealand Foundation, which is something like the Asia-Pacific Foundation in Canada, has a whole series of practical activities relating to business, relating to arts and culture, education, the setting of educational goals, the coordination, for example, of school principals to ensure that high school and junior school principals have the awareness and have coordination between themselves so that within their own education sectors they are doing necessary activities in language and training. Other forms of Asia-relevant sector training. In other words, New Zealand has come to grips and is coming to grips. It's not Valhalla, it's not perfection, but at least they are coming to grips with it. I'll mention the USA initiative, the 100,000 Strong initiative that had been announced in 2009 and formally launched in 2010 by Hillary Clinton. There she is, and she's giving a pre-presidential speech just in case she decides to run. So, Minister, keep this in mind. She might yet be the president. Madam President. The 100,000 Strong initiative has led in the American way to the creation of a foundation, to the creation of coordinating committees, and essentially aiming at 100,000 American students to visit and study in China over a period of 4 years as a starting point. And of course, the Chinese government has responded by offering 20,000 scholarships for American students to go to China. There are other activities there, activities from the Asia Society, which I'll mention later on. And in Europe, just 2 examples. In France, currently 30,000 students studying Chinese language in French high schools. 30,000. The French population is not double Canada's population. So 30,000 in France, roughly the equivalent of 18,000 in Canada. Would that we had 18,000 high school students in Canada studying Mandarin. Germany, 15,000 students, a lot less strong, and that's 15,000 both at university and at the secondary school level. So the point being, a lot going on in other countries. Our task force findings, the main findings. The first finding, surprise, surprise, this is Canada. The first finding is the basic data is very hard to find because the basic data doesn't exist. This is Canada. We teach the world about decentralization. So we conducted our own cross-Canada survey on the task force, a simple survey really looking to boards of education in 5 urban areas: Vancouver, Edmonton, Toronto, Montreal, and Halifax. What are those boards of education saying about what they are doing? So quite a simple survey. Nevertheless, very much a practitioner survey. These are the boards of education. They're actually doing something. I'll talk about the results in a moment. Fundamentally, here is one quote: we found little to equal the efforts of countries like New Zealand. We found little to show a coordinated, thoughtful approach developed over a period of time to carry students through over a large course of years. There is one exception to this, and that exception is located a mere 150 kilometers to the north of us. So you might well imagine the name of that city, which is exceptional. And as I was hearing very recently, just minutes ago, right here in Red Deer, there is exceptional training that is being done as well. Language training and awareness training in these urban areas of Canada is scattered and it's disconnected. There is some training. I'm not saying it's a null set. There is stuff, but it is scattered, it is haphazard. University training is also challenged, and is also, I would argue, rather haphazard. It's challenged by a lack of funding and a lack of emphasis. It's also, from our standpoint, scattered because it is so difficult to gather information from universities. So here is one of the other findings that probably reinforces what you know yourselves, and we draw attention to it because we want to draw attention to the sophistication, and to the track record, and also to the multiple facets that are involved in Edmonton's excellence within Canada. And I do mention that I was talking to Xin Xin a few moments ago, and she was telling me about the level of education training here in Red Deer. Another example, and of course there is educational training going on within Calgary and elsewhere, but it's really Edmonton that stands out for its coordinated approach and its long-term approach. The graph showing the enrollment within the bilingual training program. Moi, je viens de Montréal. Je peux vous parler du bilinguisme. So I can talk to you a lot about the importance of bilingual education and its tremendous impact on intellectual development among students, and the awareness, proven time and again, that 2 languages lead to 3 languages and to 4 languages. So the development of bilingual education, in this case Chinese bilingual education, very significant. Other honorable mentions, Greater Vancouver, and certainly several schools within Greater Vancouver. Greater Toronto, just beginning, just getting there. But there is an awareness, there is an interest in it. And the other 2 cities, Halifax, Montreal, far behind in this type of training, far behind. One other finding, again, known to many of you, but within our report, we draw particular attention to it. And that is the role of Hanban, the Confucius Institutes. And the reality that the Chinese state, through its program and the many presences of the Confucius Institutes, has begun to do in Canada as elsewhere a stellar job in the promotion of awareness, but above all the teaching of language and the provision of texts for the teaching of language, and developing really quite a unique approach, which is embedding the experts from the Confucius Institutes into the boards of education or the other institute. We do ask questions. As we know, there are political questions to be asked. This is not an issue which we should not discuss. Double negative. This is an issue that we should discuss, because the Confucius Institutes are an agency of the Chinese government. There is nothing wrong with that. But we should be aware of that, and we should be asking ourselves in Canada and elsewhere, to what degree should we be dependent upon the intelligence and the policies of a foreign government that has taken the initiative to teach language and culture in our society? A little bit like India saying 100 years ago, to what degree should they be dependent upon the British for teaching them English and the English ways of doing things? So keep these parallels in mind. That's why I used to teach history. Some additional educational challenges. Ones that you're very aware of, and ones that in other cities not necessarily as aware of. The first one is the reality that immersion teaching is being taken up primarily by students who have Chinese language as their heritage, whether it be Mandarin or other Chinese languages. Overwhelmingly, these are the students whose families, who themselves are motivated, and whose families are motivated. Australia has found the same thing. And Australia, despite many, many initiatives, is actually dealing with a small decline in enrollment in Mandarin language classes amongst non-heritage students. So there is a challenge. There is, of course, a comparable challenge when you get to university and someone becomes a basic language student and has to be taught at roughly the same time as someone who has Mandarin as a heritage language. So it's a challenge, right? It's not a problem. One man's problem is another man's challenge. One woman's challenge is another woman's solution. So challenges lead to solutions. A second one is that success in the education systems depends very much on community support, and community support related to Board of Education support, and from there to provincial government support. So it isn't just the student and the family, it really is that mixture of family, school, community, Board of Education, province. That's how you achieve success. The same you might say in any aspect of education, but particularly when it comes to language and cultural education. We could talk about that at any time. And the third problem that we draw attention to, really a serious problem, which is how universities fund and focus their courses, and whether universities take the step of recognizing high school training in their course credits. University of Alberta, to its credit, is now, to my best of knowledge, offering a credit to students who have successfully completed the immersion course at the high school level. That's very smart by the University of Alberta. It'll be interesting to see if other universities will do the same. But language teachers do say that they are facing problems, like other university professors in other areas. Some relate this to the general problem, the general pressure on humanities funding in universities across the country. It's an issue, it's a challenge. We can't ignore it. I'm nearing the end of my summary of the report. We looked at some other challenges going beyond purely education. So in talking about Asia consciousness and Asia competence, one clear area of learning is that happens when a student or a professor or a teacher goes abroad to work and to study. And we're aware of how amongst post-secondary students in Canada, only 3%, only 3 out of 100 are currently taking up study abroad, work abroad opportunities. This is a terrible statistic, right? This is the age of globalization. Every one of us in this room is connected to other societies and other countries. And when you've got students of 19, 20, 21-year-olds and a variety of programs available to them for summertime, for one semester, for a year, and only 3 out of 100 are taking advantage of it, we've got a problem. And I'm using the word problem more than the word challenge. Australia has doubled that percentage. Germany is at 30% and are targeting 50% of post-secondary students doing study or work abroad. Now, in Germany it's skewed because of the EU, and so those numbers will get played around with. But anyone who is involved with German companies abroad know how talented their managers usually are in dealing with host societies. A vast generalization. So, a low take-up of opportunities. Secondly, we're aware of the need for consistent and repeated and coherent exhortations by leaders, public leaders, private sector leaders, repeatedly saying to students, to the public, to teachers, it is important to become Asia competent. Minister, you do it now. I'm sure you do it time and again when you're meeting with other community leaders here in your own constituency. This has to be done everywhere within the society. It has to become a mantra. And the third is, I'm talking here from a vantage point from outside Alberta, and that is there is a virtually total absence of pan-Canadian sharing of policies, pan-Canadian sharing of experiences, and this contrasts black and white with what the Americans are doing, what the Australians are doing, what the New Zealanders are doing. We're not talking to each other. Surprise, surprise, it's Canada. We concluded our report by talking about a number of the sectors where these challenges of consciousness and competence are really central to immediate short-term success. Tourism, without a doubt. China is in the midst of becoming the world's largest supply source of tourists abroad. The report goes into some of the data that's available on where Canada ranks in Chinese tourist estimates, what is being done in other countries to make the visit by Chinese tourists in this country better serviced, better adapted to the style of the foreigner who is arriving to be a visitor in our country. Clearly, this is one area where competence is growing and must grow. Public service management. Yes, there are some tours abroad. Yes, there are some delegations. There is not, within Canada, a coherent and consistent approach to making Asia competence a part of our public service management. Australia has a commitment to ensuring that all of the executives of the Australia Federal Public Service, executive level, receive some form of Asia competency training. Other sectors, energy, agri-food, the minister mentioned that. You're aware of it. And we draw attention to the Alberta Asia Advisory Council. It is a unique, that is to say, one pocket of regional excellence within Canada. And you have established priorities already, priorities that are primarily market-oriented. I would caution you and say that as a council, you should also be talking about cultural competence. Not culture in dancing across the stage in a tutu, which is also culture, but culture in the sense of the comfort of people to talk, to deal, to interact, not only in language, in style, in values, in understanding values. That is all part of competence. The task force recommendations will be released on November the 5th. Our main finding is that Canada has islands of innovation and creativity, but we're a long way from a serious commitment to being better informed, more experienced, and more capable of engaging with Asia. A long way to go. That's great. A long way to go means that we have a lot that we can do. And we don't have to reinvent the wheel totally, because we really can see what others are doing. And elsewhere in Canada, they actually can come and see what Alberta is doing. There is a long way to go, but it's not so hard to get there. That combination of leadership and encouragement, the repetition of messages, the repetition of initiatives, encountering failures, fixing failures and starting it again, and that combination of public and private and para-public, the education systems, the health systems, tripartite, the combination of this leadership will, I think, bring us on that road towards real Asia competence. Thank you very much.
It's a good idea to know where you've come from. And, our country grew up in a very different world. Asia was not at its apogee. Asia was at its perigee, I suppose the technical term, particularly China. So the 2 centuries of great growth in Canada, the 19th and the 20th centuries were, I am a little bit China-centric here, I'll confess that, but these weren't the best years for China. And if you look historically at China's position in the globe, it had about, I'm talking over the last couple thousand years, it had 20-25% of the global GDP. It's running at about 12 right now. If it continues on its rise, it may assume its previous level. So where China's at is not yet where it's going to be. But at the time, I'll give you just one example. In 1980, 10 years after we recognized China, China's GDP, at least on paper, was slightly less than that of Canada. 1 billion Chinese had a smaller GDP than 25 million Canadians at that time. It depends partly how you count GDP, and those numbers are a little bit suspect, but the point is still sound that China was weak, China is now becoming strong, and that's the normal situation. But it's not that which we're used to. And change is challenging, and it takes constitutional adjustment, it takes adjustment in people's thinking. The center of gravity of the global economy is shifting to Asia. It doesn't mean it won't be all China, it'll be India, looking here at our former High Commissioner, it'll be Vietnam, it is Japan, it will be Korea, and all the other part of that constellation of growth. But the center of economic gravity will be there, just as the center of population is there now. 2/3 of the world's people live in Asia, approximately. They should end up over time, all things being equal, and generally we see a tendency, not equal, towards equalization of economies as the least developed develop, and as the most developed tend to stagnate somewhat. We're going to have that center. So it's not a question of should we or should we not engage with Asia. If we want to maintain our prosperity, we have no choice. It's simple reality. It was a reality to focus on Europe at the beginning of our national history. It was a reality to focus on the massive US market, which is fortunately not going to go away for us. We're not going to be ever entirely dependent upon Asia. But that painful adjustment process, I see painful because it takes a lot of change. And we've seen in the numbers from Dr. Rabinovich how difficult it is to change institutions, to change people's thinking. We've known that Asia Pacific's Foundation's been there now for how many years, Victor?
25.
25, a quarter century, and there's still much work to be done. I like his optimistic take on that. There's still much can be done. There are exceptions, of course. We had trade commissioner offices in Asia early on. In the 1920s, we had missions in Hong Kong, Shanghai, Tokyo, but it was never a key component of our national trade. If we look at the human side, of course, that came first, and there I will acknowledge the human contribution. Immigration from Asia has played a major role in the building of this province, the building of the national railway, often in difficult circumstances, and in building national institutions. And we should be proud of that. But the economic linkages were weak. That is changing, but changing far too slowly. We now have a situation where the number 2 and 3 economies are in Asia. Our national transportation sector systems are not oriented towards Asia. Look at the nightmare, speaking as Alberta now, we have getting pipelines to the West Coast. We had conversations earlier with economic departments here in Alberta about the constrictions and the difficulty of getting trains in sufficient number through the West Coast, inadequate port facilities. Our economy oriented north-south, and to extend to Atlantic now has to be reoriented in other directions. Victor mentioned the cases of Australia and New Zealand. Australia, by geography, and they call it the lucky country, and quite frankly, it is the lucky country in many ways. Its geography has been good to it as well. It could have been situated in any part of the world. It's in Asia. And in the course of the last several decades, that has been the area of fastest growth, and we can see how well Australia has done from that trade. If you look back, though, in the immediate post-war, I was born in 1950, about the time when I was born, the number 1 trading partner of Australia was still Britain. It very much looked towards Britain. Then it switched to the United States, then to Japan, and then to China. So it's 4 shifts of its primary trading partner in the course of my lifetime. In the case of Canada, it's been US, 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 and US. Well, that's been great. It's been a great economy, and it's been very good to us. But we've seen that even the number 1 economy can falter and slow. And as if you're, say, a store, and you have but 1 customer, for your product, you have a problem. And that's one of the problems we have. And the Alberta government knows that, and I think the people in the audience recognize that as well. Just very briefly on language, the most difficult thing I ever did was learn Chinese. And I'll never finish because unfortunately I fear I'm now losing characters as fast as I'm learning new ones. We're never going to have a situation where all Albertans are fluent in Chinese. It's not unreachable. I don't think that's a realistic goal to set. But we need a core of Albertans, core of Canadians who can manage in language, who are familiar with Asian cultures, who can work in those environments. If the US says they're going to have 100,000, I don't think their progress has been that quick on that. That would mean, just by simple math, we need 10,000. I think that's still a modest level. But a problem we have, and again, I call it sometimes the curse of affluence. There's that standard baseball joke. I don't know if you play baseball, but Albertans are born on third base and think they've hit a triple. Not necessarily so. And that is a particular problem for me at the university with young students who live in a great part of the world, as you all know, but to energize them to move elsewhere. External world for them is often a beach in Mexico, where it ought to be trying to unravel how the Chinese economy works, how to learn Japanese and help our country prosper through cross-Pacific trade. That is a challenge, the challenge of affluence. Chinese students, and we have over 3,000 on our campus, I find have a better global view. Simply, they've voted with their feet. They've decided, they and their parents, they want to learn a new language, they want to be part of a broader world, they want China to be part of a broader world, and I see that coming. Now, I'll finish there with a very brief plug, just show it to you. On our website, china.ualberta.ca is our survey of the views of Albertans on China, which was released last week, and you can download it from there at your convenience. Thank you.
Great, thanks very much, Gordon.